Friends, this morning I'm going to invite us to reflect on the life and legacy of the Reverend James Joseph Reeb, the Unitarian clergyman who in 1965 was martyred in the Selma struggle for voting rights. But this morning we'll begin the story at the end and work our way towards the beginning. And for our reading, we will begin with a eulogy, a portion of the eulogy that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave for James Reeb at Brown Chapel AME, the church in Selma that served as the meeting place and the organizing hub of the voting rights struggle just a few days after Reeb's murder. And we're actually going to play you a recording of a portion of this eulogy. It's not a high-quality recording. Someone recorded it in the audience that day on a reel-to-reel recorder. And so it's not the highest quality recording. But we're going to put the words up on the screen so you can read along a little bit. And I find that just the cadence and the timbre of Dr. King's voice to be both a provocation and a balm and a blessing. And so even if you can't hear everything he's saying, receive it as a blessing as we listen to about 3 minutes of, I'll just say that this comes from the middle of the eulogy when King invites his audience and us to move from the question, who killed James Reeb, to the question, what killed James Reeb? To the systemic question, which I think we'll find resonates to this very day.
Naturally, we don't fail to ask the question, who killed James Reeb? The answer is simple and well-limited. We think he was murdered by a sick, limited and misguided man who has a strange notion that you express descent to murder. That is another haunting wantonness question. We of course asked this afternoon, I asked a few days ago as we memorialized James Jackson. It is the question, what killed James Reeb? When we move from the who to what, blame is divine and the responsibility for James Reeb was murdered by the indifference of every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the state security of state management. He was murdered by the irrelevancy of a church that would stand against social evil, serve as a tail like brothers on a headlight, echo brothers and a Lord. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician. He was moved down the path of demagoguery, who has fed his constituents stale bread of meat and spoiled meat of racism. He was murdered by the brutality of every share of law enforcement agency, who practices lawlessness in the name of law. He was murdered by the stupidity of the federal government that had spent millions of dollars a day to keep troops in South Vietnam, yet did not protect the lives of his own citizens, seeking constitutional rights. Yes, he was even murdered by the cowardice of every people who massively accept the evil system of segregation system, the way of life, philosophy which produces is people work unrealistic, make the American dream a reality. So he did not die in vain. God still has a way to.
On March 7, 1965, 600 African American citizens of Alabama set out on a march from Selma to Montgomery, the capital, to demand the right to vote. The march was led by the young SNCC leader, later Congressman John L. Lewis. But the marchers that day didn't get far before Sheriff Jim Clark and his deputies, wielding billy clubs and tear gas, horses and dogs, brutally attacked the marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Bloody Sunday, they called it. The nightly news carried footage of the brutal violence into living rooms across the country. The next day, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King sent out an urgent call for Northern clergy to come to Selma and join the voting rights struggle there. One clergy person who received Dr. King's call was a young Unitarian Universalist minister living in Roxbury named James Reeb. When Dr. King's invitation arrived, Reeb and his wife, Marie, considered together the importance of the Selma struggle, as well as the risks involved in going. And they agreed that he should go. The next morning, Reeb said goodbye to Marie and their 4 children and hopped a flight to Selma with many other Unitarian clergy from Boston. The day was filled with protests and organizing, but later that night, as Reeb and 2 colleagues were leaving a Black-owned diner in Selma, they were jumped by a mob of Klansmen who bludgeoned Reeb with a club. Badly bleeding from the head, Reeb was rushed to the hospital in Selma where he was refused treatment because he was a civil rights worker. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital in Montgomery, 50 miles away, it was too late to save him. Reeb's death made national headlines, and soon thereafter, President Johnson invoked Reeb's name in a speech before a joint session of Congress as he demanded that Congress pass the Voting Rights Act. Reeb's name would join those of Jimmy Lee Jackson, Amelia Boynton, John Lewis, Viola Liuzzo, and so many other heroes and martyrs of the great Selma voting rights struggle. And for many years, it seemed that that struggle for voting rights had been won, right? Right? Its victory seemed secure, but then in 2013, the Supreme Court in Shelby v. Holder effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act. And since that egregious ruling, a rising tide of voter suppression, intimidation, racial gerrymandering, and political violence has threatened to undermine our democracy. And so I find myself going back to the story of James Reeb and the struggle for which he died, a struggle that remains ours to this day. And I offer his story not as some kind of white savior story, because he just played a bit part in this story, but I offer it as a story of what we might learn from a Unitarian Universalist life of moral commitment and purpose. What can James Reeb teach us? Because it wasn't an accident or a coincidence that Jim Reeb ended up in Selma that night. As a friend of Jim's said at his memorial service, the same one Dr. King spoke at, he said, Jim started marching long before Selma. But when did his march begin? For that matter, when and how did we first set out on the journey that has brought us to the commitments and values that we hold today? What were the steps along our journey? Now, you could argue that Jim's march to Selma began right here in Boston. Just 10 months before his death, Reeb uprooted his family in Washington, D.C., and moved them to Roxbury, where they set up house, and he took a job working for affordable housing in that neighborhood. Many of us were just in Roxbury last month with GBIO, again working for affordable housing, right? When does the march begin and when does it end? Was it in Roxbury where Jim's march began? Or was it earlier? In Washington, D.C., Reeb served for 6 years as the associate minister of All Souls Church, where I recently served for many years. And when I arrived at All Souls, Jim was still remembered fondly by many in the congregation. He'd married some of the couples that were still there, blessed their children. Some had been teens in the youth group that he led there. Once, an African-American elder at All Souls took me aside and told me a story about how Reeb once pushed back against the concerns of a white parent in Sunday school who didn't think the children should be learning about the civil rights movement in Sunday school. It was too political. She remembers Reeb telling the parent how important it was to teach to our children's moral formation, that they know of and participate in struggles for justice. Though Reeb was a beloved pastor at All Souls, his heart was really in the community. Reeb worked closely with leaders at Howard University nearby to create and run an organization that helped feed, clothe, and shelter those who lived in poverty in the neighborhood around the church and university. So maybe that's where his march began. Or was it earlier still? You should know that Jim Reeb didn't start out a Unitarian. He grew up in Wyoming as a conservative Christian, a fundamentalist, really. In college, Jim's friends would sometimes tease him by picking out some of the most inane details of the Bible and asking him, "You don't believe that, do you?" To which he would reply, "Well, if you can't accept everything in the Bible is true, why accept anything?" While studying for the ministry at Princeton Seminary, Reeb handed in a paper for his theology class entitled "The Wrath of God," in which he wrote with downright gusto about God's judgment upon a depraved humanity. I know, I've read excerpts from the paper. A delighted Princeton theologian professor gave Jim an A and scrawled "excellent work" across the top of the paper. Yikes. But soon afterwards, Reeb suffered a crisis of faith. Just out of seminary, he took a job as a chaplain at a Philadelphia hospital, serving the city's poor and indigent. Reeb felt a powerful sense of call to that work. He felt his heart open in compassion and solidarity with the people that he served, yet his theology taught him that his patients, the poorest of the poor, many suffering from addiction, his theology taught him that they deserved their suffering, that it was somehow God's just punishment for their sins. And there in that hospital in Philly, caring for the poor and the sick, Reeb experienced what can only be described as a conversion. And this is what happens to us when our inherited belief systems come up against the lived reality of our experience and come into conflict with one another. And then we suffer a crisis of faith, and we all have to become theologians then. Reeb was overcome by a generous and loving spirit that melted the cold Calvinism in his heart. And he realized suddenly that any God worth worshiping was a God who heaped mercy and love upon those who suffered, not judgment and scorn. And I'll tell you, he wrote something in his journal at that time that is very telling, and that's always haunted me. He wrote this: "When the moralist in you dies, then life begins." Friends, sometimes I feel like I'm still longing for that moralist to die in my heart. Still longing to be born again. I think this is the moment that Jim Reeb gave his life in service to others. I think this is where Jim's march to Selma really began. How about you? When did your journey to a life of commitment begin? What steps did you take along the way? When did the moralist in you die? Nearly 10 years ago, at the 50th anniversary of the Selma March, I had the privilege of finally meeting Marie Reeb, Jim's wife and widow. And we had the opportunity to speak for a while down in Selma about her family and about the All Souls congregation where I was serving then. And as we embraced one another and said goodbye, I found myself making a promise to her. I promised her that the congregation and I would do everything in our power to honor her sacrifice, her husband and her family's sacrifice, by completing the struggle for which they gave so much. I actually use those words, completing the struggle. And I see now the hubris in that statement, and the naivete even. But back in 2015, down there in Selma for that anniversary, it actually did feel as though we might be on the cusp of building a movement that could strike a decisive victory for our democracy. And so much has changed since then. But that promise keeps me coming back. What Jim and Marie's story reminds me of is that to love and to protect our democracy is not for the faint of heart. It's rather to enter into a long and proud and sometimes perilous legacy of struggle. Dr. King liked to paraphrase the Boston Unitarian minister Theodore Parker by saying, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." I believe that. I do. But sometimes it feels like that arc isn't bending fast enough, doesn't it? And sometimes it feels like it bends away from justice before it bends back again. So who can say where and when a great march for justice begins? And who knows when it will end? What we do know is that today the march goes on. How fortunate we are that we march in the footsteps of courageous ancestors. How fortunate we are that we march not alone, but side by side, shoulder to shoulder with one another. Amen.